All right, to everybody watching on Twitch and everybody watching on YouTube after the fact, welcome to the party stream, and we're doing a little bit something different today. As you can see the giant ring light on the glossy cover, we have Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. Wound up getting this last week, did a full read-through of it, some pretty deep analysis, and oh boy, do I got some opinions. I got opinions. And I am informed that the YouTube laws require me to state it that way, so that's how I'm saying it. So, for those not in the know, Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft is the newest book available for the D&D 5th edition system. And according to the back, it is Face Your Fears! Ravenloft is a classic D&D campaign setting involving originally gothic horror, but this is kind of trying to make it evolve to more generalized horror, and combining it with D&D, and that's a little bit of an odd concept and a little bit of an odd combination, because D&D is ultimately a superhero game, and horror does kind of rely on disempowerment and isolation. But we're going to go over some stuff, a little bit of background. I am a horror nut. I love horror. I love all things spooky. I probably run more horror games than I run every other genre combined. I am a huge fan of Savage Worlds, which comes from a horror game, Call of Cthulhu, which is a horror game. I love getting all sorts of advice on how to make things spooky and creepy and atmospheric. I watch spooky movies all the time. My fiance and I both enjoy this, and neither one of us are very easily scared. And if we find stuff that actually scares us, we love it. Unlike a lot of reviewers, I do wear my biases on my sleeve. So I will go ahead and let you know that I don't have a ton of experience with the original Ravenloft. But I do think that as far as D&D editions go, 5th edition is probably the best one that there's been. I am a fan of it. I do enjoy it. I don't want to run it for everything, but I do think it achieves what it sets out to do, and I think it does that very well. So that being said, we're going to go and start moving through. Now, for the most part, for this format, I'm going to be doing a good, the bad, and the ugly thing. We're going to start out positive with all the stuff about the book that I do like. We're going to move to the stuff that's negative, then we're going to move to kind of things that are more neutral, and we're going to wrap up with some discussion and analysis of some specific sections of the book, as well as some final kind of overall analysis of some of the subtext and what I believe they tried to accomplish with this book and what they did accomplish. And I do believe that those are two very different things. So this is going to be a little bit of a... I got a drink for this one. This one's going to be controversial. So, we're going to start out... Oh, by the way, for everybody involved, this is not a first impression page through. This is a deep dive, analysis, and criticism. I have read this book cover to cover. I've had a lot of time to digest it. Once again, I love horror. I read fast. This is going to be me going through and giving a full, honest opinion from a very experienced horror game master. Okay, so we're going to go and start out that overall, we're going to start out with the good. And anywhere you see here where I have purple is stuff that I think is good. Yellow is going to be neutral, red's going to be the bad. So the very beginning that I like, the overall concept of Ravenloft has always appealed to me. The idea that these horrible, monstrous people are drawn into Ravenloft as prisoners and then are basically tormented in ways that are designed to torment and torture them specifically in an emotional and psychological way. Just that very concept screams gothic horror. So I think that even though they did try to pry the gothic horror label away from Ravenloft, the entire thing is still gothic horror, and every single domain and element embodies that. So the first chapter, they do start out, they define what makes Ravenloft specifically what it is. They have a little thing in here that says, hey, content warning, this is going to be a scary thing. And I like that they do that. I think, honestly, most horror should have a content warning on it for not necessarily exactly what it contains, but just kind of have a, yo, just so you know, this is going to be some spooky stuff, and you might not be comfortable with it. So I do appreciate that. We're going to move on, and I also like that in this sidebar, even though that they're sitting there kind of defining the overall structure of Ravenloft, with the idea of the Domains of Dread not being necessarily a setting, but more of a concept. And I really like that because it gives the Dungeon Master open game, an open season to play around with this stuff and make it so this stuff doesn't necessarily make sense. You can't reliably walk from one domain to another. And that helps with the horrific feel. But I like that they put this in here very, very first. This is probably the single best bit of horror advice that they give in the entire book, which is another topic that we're going to be getting to. Cultivating hope. One of the problems you can run into with horror games and horror in general is you need to focus on the pacing. It can't be all spooky all the time, and it can't be completely hopeless as a general rule. There are exceptions. I will get to those. But for the most part, there has to be some glimmer of hope. If there's no hope, one of two things happens to people, and this is just naturally what we think of. Either you get complete paralysis, or people galvanize and just grit their teeth and move forward and say, I'm taking as many of you some bitches down with me as I can. So when you're having that spooky, high tense situation, there always has to be some element of hope to keep people running. And this is human psychology. Pretty much everybody works that way. So, character creation. Overall, I really like the character options that they have in here. I think that they're really nifty. This starts out right here with beginning a very basic thing for players. You are joining a horror game. You are expecting that this is going to be scary. The mere act of joining a horror game means you need to be prepared to be scared and willing to be scared. And not just throwing as much bravado as you can with that, because this is a different type of game. And they even have a thing on here on preparing to be scared, and then not worrying about having your characters be scared. Quite frankly, characters in D&D should be scared a lot more than they are. You're in dark dungeons, there are traps everywhere, there are horrible monsters. These things would be terrifying. This kind of gives you that guideline of don't be afraid to let your character be afraid. We start moving on to some other things. They go into a couple habits of horror heroes, which is good to know. Then we move on to the actual meat and potatoes of this chapter. So it starts out, we have 3 lineages, which lineages are kind of replacing race in a lot of ways. I think that's a good move. I think that we've kind of evolved societally as a people, and I think the term race is becoming really loaded. And I think lineage kind of like softens that a little bit, but more importantly, it does seem that D&D is looking for ways to escape those boxes that they put characters in. And moving from race to lineage and being able to mix and match stuff kind of helps that out. The 3 we have in here, we have Vampire, which is kind of like a half undead thing where they just say, you in some way, shape, or form, feast and feed upon the living. Maybe you are half vampire, maybe you're part illithid, a parasite lives in you. There's a lot of different ways that you can skin this, but overall, it's a really cool concept. I do wish that creature type, they just said, you're also undead. I've heard that there were a lot of game balance mechanics that were difficult with that by having humanoid and undead. But you can just say, you're undead, and healing spells still work on you. It's not that difficult. That is one thing I have noticed, that D&D still seems very, very loath to break their own rules. They like expanding them, but they don't like actually changing them for things. And I think that's very much to their detriment. Next we have the Hexblood. I went ahead and I'll go and comment on this one now because we're kind of on that. I kind of put this one as more neutral. The idea of a Hexblood is that you're kind of like almost like a changeling that was like brought in half Fey. And you're kind of bound to some sort of greater Fey creature and you get Fey powers. The only reason I put this as neutral is that part of it kind of feels like it's stepping on the toes of the Fey Pact Warlock. But I suppose if you just wanted to kind of be a more Fey type changeling, and especially with how much there is in some of the domains, I guess it makes sense. I mean, it's definitely not negative, but I just think it could be done a little different. Reborn kind of feels weird to me. The premise of Reborn is that you somehow return from death. Maybe you died and got brought back as like a flesh golem Frankenstein's monster type deal. Maybe you were haunted and it's just your corpse walking around. Something like that. But with the prevalence of resurrection magic in Dungeons & Dragons and the idea of the revolving door afterlife, it just seems a little bit odd to me. Now, if you were playing a game where the DM just said resurrection magic doesn't work, which quite frankly, I think in Ravenloft, they should have just straight up said resurrection magic doesn't work. This makes a lot more sense at that point. So we got that. Now, moving along, we're moving on to the Dark Gifts. Now, the Dark Gifts overall, I'm very glad that they put these in. I do think they add quite a bit to the game as a whole. The idea that there is something you have that's just not quite right. It's power, but at a price. And I think that D&D needs that, because up to this point, abilities don't have drawbacks. Pretty much nothing in your D&D character has drawbacks, but these do. That being said, the drawbacks are a mixed bag. From a personal standpoint, I like the idea of a drawback being, yeah, you get this cool thing, but hey, JS Twitch, yes, you made it to a stream. Congratulations, my friend. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being the first one to mention in chat. We are doing a deep dive of Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, because I got opinions and I got to share them. So, but for example, like the Echoing Soul, the downside of it is that it has an intrusive echoes. Whenever you make a roll and roll a 1, you have to roll on a random table. And I know my players, and I know players in general, this is just going to come off as being funny. And one of the issues with horror games is pacing, and you need to maintain that tension and that mood. And having humor thrown in can be a good thing, provided it's being done on your terms. Random humor can just completely derail the game and ruin the atmosphere you've been doing. And unfortunately, a lot of the Dark Gifts kind of have that as an idea. I mean, they're cool concepts, but it's just that the drawback for them just seems to be this weird, random effect that they have. And I think that's kind of a... I just think that's a missed opportunity. Meanwhile, like Mistwalker, Mistwalker is really cool because it gives the idea that you can navigate the mists of Ravenloft, which is a really big deal in this setting. But as a downside, you cannot set routes. If you stay in an area for an extended period of time, you just can't rest. You're so restless, you have to keep moving, and that is brilliant. That's fantastic. And I wish they had more stuff like that happening. Moving on, we have the subclass options. Now, the subclass options, I will be completely honest, I do not mechanically know as much about D&D 5th edition as I should, especially when it comes to the player side of things. I think I've played maybe 2 games of 5th edition. I'm almost always behind the screen, so I don't have a very strong opinion on what happens. That being said, I will say the Carlos of Spirits seems interesting, with the idea that there are stories with hidden power, but the mechanics just seem a little bit strange because they have like this weird random bonus, but at least you get to figure out what the random bonus is before assigning it. Undead Pact Warlock. Okay, this is such a no-brainer for Ravenloft. This had to have been in here. The idea that you have a warlock that made a pact with an undead creature, that's perfect. The backgrounds that they put in, the idea of changing things, it's, you know, they're backgrounds. They are what they are. Now, the horror trinkets, I think that this table's awesome. Instead of having a normal trinket, you can do a horror trinket, and some of these are just amazing. Like, randomly, you can have a walking cane with an iron ferrule that strikes sparks on stone. You can have an eye patch embroidered with a holy symbol, a small portrait of you as a child along your identically dressed twin. It's just fantastic and super gothic stuff. I love it. I love this table. I love the trinkets in general, but the horror ones are even better. So now we're going to move on to the real meat and potatoes of this book. I have a philosophy when it winds up coming to RPG books that you can tell what the focus is on things by the order that chapters are put and by the page count of a given topic. This is how much of it is devoted to setting. This book is almost entirely setting, and if you ignore everything else but the setting parts of this book, you will be pretty damn satisfied. I will go ahead and stake my reputation as a game master on that. I like the fact that they start out with creating domains of dread. They don't move on to, here are the existing domains. They don't talk about all that. They talk about this is how you make your own, and they encourage you to make your own. And on top of that, they encourage the domain and the Dark Lord you make to be a sinister reflection of your party. Have them stand opposite of your party and be twisted, corrupted versions of them, or be the exact opposite. That's great. It is encouraging you to design your world based on your player characters, and that is a piece of advice that needs to be in more books. Because as far as I'm concerned, the only when I sit down and play a game with my friends, the only world that exists in the game is that game with me and my friends. I don't care what happens at other people's table. So that moves on. And then we start moving on to the descriptions of the different genres of horror. I am going to start getting a little bit more critical with this, but I do think that overall the body horror one is pretty good. we're gonna skip the neutral ones because I'm gonna get to why they're more of my neutral ones later. The description of Folklore is a lot of fun. I like the fact that they included a little spiel on it. If you haven't seen like The Ritual, Midsummer, they're really fun. Folklore is becoming more and more popular, and I like the fact that it is becoming a part of our horror lexicon. So, moving on, ghost stories. I will be honest, I am a I am a sucker for a good ghost story. I would say overall, I don't necessarily define the genre of horror as being ghost stories, although that's how they decided to. I tend to prefer things as being atmospheric. I like a lot of ambiance. I like a creepy atmosphere. I like all of those techniques that are really, really common to ghost stories. If you've ever seen the Netflix series The Haunting of Hill House, that's this to the T. The Conjuring movies in the mainline series, not the spinoffs, this to a T. It's fantastic, and as far as I'm concerned, this is like the really unsettling stuff that can stick with people a long time because it focuses on imagery, mood, and atmosphere, and that's what I love. And they do a pretty decent job of describing, how to run a good ghost story, and I do like that. Gothic horror. I mean, if you're playing Ravenloft and you don't like Gothic horror, you're playing the wrong game. I mean, everything in this is Gothic horror. We're talking about moody atmosphere, over-the-top villains, highly charged emotions, of clear-cut good and evil, all that stuff. Like romance from a historical perspective, not like a loving kisses perspective. Read yourself some Poe, read Mary Shelley, read Bram Stoker, read even the Portrait of Dorian Gray if you want to get some Oscar Wilde. That is what this is. Everything in Ravenloft is Gothic horror, even if it does not list it. The setting itself is Gothic. They got the other general descriptions. I don't really have too much to say about those. Let's start moving into the domains of Ravenloft, and now let's go ahead and start talking about the domains, what I like and what I don't. We're still going to start focusing on the good. Barovia. I like the fact that Barovia is first, because Barovia was the first domain, and quite frankly, when people think of Ravenloft, they think of Barovia, they think of Strahd, they think of the Ravenloft version of the vampire Dracula, the undead despot, the terrified Eastern European Romanian village, all that kind of stuff, and it's all in Barovia. They do a full 6-page spread of it. They've got Strahd. The only real criticism I have about Strahd is they seem to be moving more into the territory of... I'm going to turn my music down a little bit. They seem to be moving the... vampire as being like this like urbane being, and that's something that I have a difficulty getting behind, just because vampires have such a long history of being metaphors for predators, specifically sexual predators, and it always makes me uncomfortable when people start romanticizing that and bring that into, like, instead of it being sexual predator, it's sexy, and just always that never sits well with me. Bloodspur. So I don't know a ton about Ravenloft from previous editions, but I do know that Bloodspur was basically just thrown in as an excuse for this is why we have Illithids in Ravenloft. It's completely different now. You will actually have adventures, not necessarily in Bloodspur, but dealing with it. They actually defined what the Godbrain did to get trapped in Ravenloft. They have a torment for the Godbrain, but more importantly, Bloodspur actually sends mind flayers and vampiric mind flayers out and about in order to gather things and kidnap victims, perform bizarre experiments on them, and then return them to observe. And when you leave Bloodspur, your memories are suppressed. They can come to over time. So you'll have these random memories of your time being abducted by aliens returning to you. They turned it into a straight up alien abduction story. And that is a really cool concept. That's a great idea if it's happening to a player character, if it's happening to NPCs that they have to help. And they have like all sorts of things. One of them is that there's for the adventures. A farmer hires the characters to protect his family, for whom he believes, without any evidence, are being abducted and returned every night. And they could be. That's great. Let's go ahead and move on to the next good one that I like. Dementliu. I know a lot of the interviews have been kind of really talking of Dementliu, and for a reason. This is one of the best domains in this book. It is, depending on how you're interpreting it, I would say it's probably like a Paris type deal. It's definitely French. The Dark Lord is basically a darker version of Cinderella. This is dark fairy tales. There are even hags that act as fairy godmothers to go to the ball. It's dealing with the concept of everybody's wearing a mask, everybody's making themselves to be something bigger than they are. And on top of that, they have an entire section of what happens when your characters get invited to the masquerade ball and how to run that. And that's awesome. That is just fantastic. It's a great way to run an adventure. It's got plenty of opportunity for super creepiness. I love it. Okay, we got some neutral. Haslan. I liked Haslan. Haslan, they went ahead and they're portraying it as disaster horror with magic run amok, with the reality itself is being frayed and unraveling around it from all the abusive magical working that's happening. This is Volcano, The Core, Twister, all of those disaster moves you can think of, not necessarily in horror territory, but it's still just a fun playground to go ahead and work with. And I do like that. On top of that, they've got this element of paranoia that the Dark Lord can see everything through his symbol. Plus, you get to play with giant kaiju monsters. Ikath. There's not very often where I will go through an RPG supplement and find something that truly inspires me and that I find to be absolutely inspired. It's just brilliant. Their portrayal of Ikath is. I do not want to spoil this. I want you to read it. I want you to understand that they call it body horror, cosmic horror. I don't care what this is. This is atmospheric. It is creepy. It's mysterious. It is rife with the ability to have amazing, scary stories in this domain. It is Chinese mythology based. It's got some of my favorite Chinese ghost story monsters in them. And let me tell you what, if you want to see some creepy ass ghost stories, look at Chinese legend. Ghosts mean something very, very different to that culture than they do to Americans and Europeans. But it is amazing. And this is by far my favorite domain. And I don't want to spoil any of it and ruin any of it for people reading. Calicari. This is another one that I like that they're pulling Ravenloft, or at least they're trying to pull it away from a really Eurocentric view. This is Ravenloft India. You basically have two rival family powers. They're from the same family, but they're constantly taking over and constantly warring against each other. So this place is locked in a civil war. And your choice is basically between a Death Knight and a Rakshasa and who you back. It works heavily with the renown and the way of siding with one side or another, playing the two against each other, which is really, really cool. This is really less of a horror domain, and it really moves more into a dark fantasy. I don't think dark fantasy necessarily is horror, but it does move in more into that territory. But it's a lot of fun, and I think you could have some really good stories in Calicari. Next, we have Cartacus. Cartacus is kind of like a mostly wooded area. It took me a little bit of time to pick up on Cartacus and exactly what it is. It's Disney. It's based off of performance. Nothing is real. Everything is staged and special effects and sets. In fact, the first town you come into literally is a giant set with the actual town underground, and they access the set where they just play act as this idyllic village. It is Disney World. Magic Kingdom down here in Orlando it has tunnels underneath it that everybody comes in and out of. The Dark Lord they have, Hark and Lucas, they threw so much of Walt Disney's storyline into this guy. That is what this is. It is creepy Disney. You break out into random song. It's about performance and about nothing. It's about everything being fake. Run this thing as creepy Disney and you will not be disappointed. Lamortia is another one I really liked. This is kind of like the science gone amok. It's the Frankenstein's monster. This is one where they changed the Dark Lord from the previous ones from Victor Mordenheim to Victra Mordenheim. But the actual storyline of it's all about just perversions of science. This is the only one I would say legitimately epitomizes the body horror aspect. They talk about like brain in a jar. They talk about brain swaps. the possibility of Victor Mordenheim saving someone's life, but that's not what you want. All sorts of like perversions of science, abominations of nature, really, really fun imagery that you can play around with. Let's move on to the next one I like, Rich Malot. This is France immediately before the French Revolution. There's a huge gap between rich and poor, and it is plague, 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 plague. There's a cabal of were-rats that are just constantly making more virulent and worse versions of the plague as people find cures for them. They also put in the actual full cycle of disease and full cycle of plague for how to do this constant rise, fall, rise, fall. And just as a study in rising and falling action, this one is definitely worth reading. Then we have Tempest or Tepesh, or I don't know exactly what it is. This one is all about folklore and living in the wilderness and all the dark fae. The Dark Lord, best I can say, is basically like a Baba Yaga type, which does make me think that this place is supposed to be kind of Russian. But yeah, creepy forest, fae in the forest, folk horror. This reminded me a lot of the movie Midsummer. Lot of fun, and I think some really good options for some creepy stuff. All right, so then after that, we're going to move on to what I also really like, the idea of they have a bunch of just really quick write-ups of a bunch of other domains for you to kind of fill in yourself. And a bunch of these are really cool. Sire 1313, the Morning Rail, is pulled in from the Eberron setting, and it's just a train. It's a train of the dead. It's great. That's a great trope. I love that it's there. Clore is a place where all of the domains that are no longer around are just slowly falling into this like black hole type deal. And they even reference the Necropolis and Sithicus. They have a reference to Lord Soth here, who is no longer in Ravenloft because he got pulled out in one of the Dragon Stones. I also appreciate. I don't necessarily think it belongs in here, but the Vaj Agency. It's basically a film noir, and the moment you walk into this detective agency, everything turns into a gray monotone, and I'm pretty sure a saxophone starts playing. So that's fun. I don't know if it necessarily belongs in here, but that's fun. All right, we're going to skip some stuff that I don't like. Next, we have on the stuff that I like. This is going to be an entire thing on its own. I'm going to get to the adventure afterwards. So we're going to wrap up in what I think is probably the overall most useful chapter of the book, the monsters. Horror, you got to have monsters. And every monster that they put descriptions on like how to use monsters a bit. But then the monsters themselves, every single one of them is a winner. They're all great. There's not a single weak entry in the monster section of this book. So, having gone through the good stuff, you would think that we're going to be good, and that I will give this an overall good rating. And I can't bring myself to do that, because now we're going to have to talk about the bad. So, first off, paging through, we've got the domains. If you've been watching the previews, if you've been paying attention to interviews, they've been talking up the Carnival. And I think the Carnival is a tremendous missed opportunity. This is when I'm going to have to need the drink. You've got a creepy Carnival. Great. This is a fantastic opportunity, right? You're thinking American Horror Story. Every carnival you've ever been to is a creepy place to begin with. The problem is, the writers of this, or whoever wrote this, depended on you automatically having that imagery, because even though they threw all of this stuff in, they didn't actually throw in very much that would be scary. They threw in some stuff that was weird, maybe one thing that could actually be legitimately scary. Ravenloft, every domain of Ravenloft is supposed to be about the Dark Lord. It is their personal torment and showing how evil and dark and twisted they are and how irredeemable they are. And that's one of the things that is even directly stated, that Dark Lords are irredeemable. Isolde, the leader of the carnival, is a tragic figure who does everything she can to protect and take care of the outcasts that make up her carnival. She is not the Dark Lord. Dark Lord's the sword. It's an intelligent sword that's given no backstory, and I don't understand what the sword did that was so bad to create a Ravenloft domain. It is weak tea. That's straight up what it wound up becoming. The carnival, they say that the scariest thing is that the longest it stays in place, more accidents start happening. Well, that's great, but that's not necessarily scary. They just didn't put in enough that's spooky in this. It's just it's not even dark fantasy. It's just regular fantasy. And I just can't get behind that. Next, we got Darkon. Darkon's one of the classic Ravenloft domains. It was one of the biggest. It was one of the most influential. There was an element in the previous editions of Darkon where if you spent long enough in Darkon, the domain would alter your memories so that you thought you had always lived in Darkon. There's not an ounce of that in here. The best, creepiest part of it has been taken out. Instead, it's kind of being ripped apart because the Dark Lord is gone. And with Aslan Rex the Lich no longer in it, they give 3 potential future Dark Lords and a couple options of, this is why it's going up. It's up to you which one. It's just, once again, they took something and basically added a little bit of disaster fantasy and then stripped everything away that would make it scary. This isn't horror. This is barely even in dark fantasy. So those irritated me, especially when you have such fertile ground and then you just don't pounce on it. The carnival should have been low-hanging fruit. All right, and now I'm going to go ahead and move on to the really big issue that I have with this book. And it's entirely this chapter. It starts out with a section, Understanding Horror. And as I will go ahead and make my case, it begins with understanding horror and then proceeds to completely misunderstand horror. So this is when you would expect, because D&D is largely targeted towards beginners and role-playing games. This is when you would expect you would get Horror 101. Here's the basics of how to make something spooky. Here's stuff about atmosphere and timing and payoff, anticipation and payoff, all the basic things that you need to know to run a horror game and create that horror mood. This gives you none of that. What this does is it proceeds to spend the entire time talking about how you need 100% consent and you should not ever make your players uncomfortable. Being uncomfortable is the entire point of horror. If you are not uncomfortable, you are not watching horror. That is the whole point. It is creepy. It is disquieting. It is disturbing. They talk about the content and themes question. They put a big emphasis on general phobias, and this is where I start really, really having an issue with it. Setting expectations for a horror game is an extremely important thing to do. For the most part, you can set those expectations by telling people, I am running a horror game. People do not walk into a horror movie and expect it to be sunshine and rainbows. The moment you say it's horror, they know what they're getting into. They know it's going to be spooky. Now, playing on phobias that people have. If you have a person at your table, a player who is scared of spiders, I personally have zero problem including spiders in my game if that is the case. Absolutely none. Because it's a phobia. First off, by its very definition, you're describing things. So there is a filter between the content and the person's fear. That filter almost always will prevent a phobia from triggering. I play horror games with people who have actual phobias. My fiance is real bad with insects. I'm bad with heights. I know people who are bad with public speaking, spiders, clowns, needles, all that kind of stuff. The thing is, mechanically, when you sit down at a table and you're just describing that, it might get a little bit into the phobia to creep them out, but not enough for it to be harmful. Phobias are fine to play off of. What's not fine to play off of is traumas. And this is the biggest issue I wind up having with this. It takes this ham-handed, one-size-fits-all solution and recommends you use it. The book recommends that you start off the campaign with a horror content survey, because nothing says fun and spooky like a survey. And then it says you should take the themes the themes, monster types, and whatnot that you're going to feature in the campaign and ask people if they're okay with that. But by doing this, you completely rob the mystery out of the horror game. and it stops being scary at that point. I'm not saying you should start featuring sensitive, objectionable material that hits really close to home and is going to potentially dredge up really bad memories and experiences that people have. That stuff you need to avoid. You need to learn how to read the room, and the basic skills needed to run a horror game require you to be able to read the room. I would have rather seen that, a section on how to read the room. Absolutely, you should set expectations. Absolutely, you should talk to your players. And if they say, hey, I've got a really big problem with this, even if it's described, then don't feature it. Put the onus on the players. That being said, what they really are trying to dance around and get at, and I wish they would directly straight up say, is the things that are very, very dangerous to include in your game, and from a personal standpoint, I would never recommend people do, are the sensitive and potentially objectionable material that relate to real life traumas. Sexual assault. I cannot tell you, if you are going to include that into your game, you got to be really freaking careful about who's in there and the setting that you're in. If it's your home game and you know for 100% sure everybody's involved in it, then you can do it. From a personal standpoint, I don't enjoy those kind of stories, so I don't include them in there. And that removes probably 50% of what you're going to run into that'll be problematic in your games. You don't need a full survey to do that. Even if you watch movies that talk about sexual assault, and that's the big one. I mean, you could talk about your homophobia, real life racism, discrimination, all that kind of stuff. That's a little bit difficult and tricky too, but not like it's not as triggering and traumatic as sexual assault. Even movies will dance around that topic. Abuse is kind of part of this. If you want a good example of how that stuff is danced around in movies, watch the new version of The Invisible Man with Elizabeth Moss. First off, it's a great movie. It's brilliant, but it portrays the concept of abusive horror without ever directly going into what happened. You know that woman was horribly abused and manipulated, and you can see in metaphor a vision of her being unable to completely escape within her own mind. It was a fantastically done movie. But it's not like there was a giant survey at the front saying, hey, are you okay with seeing an abusive relationship? It's not necessary. It's ham-handed, and even more than that, it creates a shockingly oversimplification and misunderstanding of how actual trauma and PTSD work in real life. Real PTSD triggers frequently have nothing to do with the related incident. It's just something that happened to be around that stuck out when the incident happened. There's a reason why there's that stereotype of Vietnam veterans who were traumatized by various things not being able to hear helicopters without breaking down, because it was the helicopters they were hearing when the bad shit happened. This is not a good way to do it. It is ham-handed. They go into your gameplay questions and they start talking about how do you feel about effects that take away what your character does. Look, the loss of control and disempowerment, those are core themes of horror. You will run into those in damn near every horror story you run into. Isolation, loss of control, disempowerment. Those are the three big themes of horror. It is telling you you should not include at least one of those in here. I can't tell you that I'm not saying that it's necessarily a bad idea to keep an eye on what your characters can handle, on what your players can handle, and what they can't. But this book directly says, don't scare the players, scare the characters. You don't go to a horror movie to watch people be scared. You go to a horror movie to be scared. It's catharsis. It's the purging of negative emotions through fiction by vicariously feeling them. This is removing the catharsis from horror. You can do it responsibly. You can do it safely, but you can't do it comfortably, and that's the point. And I know if I'm going to get flack, that's what this is going to be. This is the section it's going to be for. They're taking everything about horror and wrapping it in nerf. It doesn't have an edge. Horror has to have bite. Then we move on to the other biggest issue I have with this book. They spend all this time, effort, and focus on making it a safe space for people. Then they forget to actually put in any good advice for making stuff scary. They have a section on horror atmosphere. that is entirely about the physical room you're playing in and not the setting, not the tale you're weaving. It's got nothing to do with the mists of Ravenloft and describe them as being clammy and smelling vaguely of rot, entering your mouth and leaving a foul taste of bile, and all those wonderful things you can do. It's sitting there talking about make sure you have proper seating, make sure you can go ahead and put on music. It's such a surface level of horror that it's just not anything good. Even then, when they start talking about describing horror, they start talking about this is how you describe monsters while they're attacking, and they never mention the single number one rule of monsters in horror: don't show the monster. Which one is scarier? Seeing a werewolf attacking somebody in an alley, being near the alley, hearing a growl and a scream and seeing a blood trail, or hearing a growl and scream, hearing a scuffle, then silence and nothing. It's about mood. And they just don't describe that. When they talk about horror gameplay and horror threats, they say specifically don't remove your player character's abilities. Don't remove what makes the player character mechanically the player character. That is terrible advice. That is absolutely terrible advice and removes the theme of disempowerment from this book. If you want to play a horror game and you really want to get it feeling, you really want to get them to feel it, everything that is given can be taken away. Everything. Take away long rests, take away specific magic spells, break their weapons, attack them at night and keep them not having their armor on, make abilities that they rely on not work. Make them work for it. Then we have the subvert cliches sidebar, which is just a sidebar that says don't be racist. Quite frankly, if you're listening to people that need to be told don't be racist, they're not going to listen to this, and it's wasted space on a book that is already short on space for the content it has. Then finally, they have their encouraged space, where they sit here and they make this big deal about having asking permission for doing things to player characters, having elaborate schemes and passing around blank cards every hour to make sure everybody is okay with what's going on, to keep people anonymous if they need to remove a theme from it. If something is really that bad and people need to let you know, it would be really amazing if every single one of us had a magical piece of glass in their pocket that could send text messages without alerting anybody else in the game. If only that piece of equipment existed and we all had it in our pockets at all time. I would sure love to have that magical piece of glass in my pocket that would allow all of my players to communicate with me whatever they needed to without letting anybody else know. All right. I've worked myself up enough. Let's go ahead and move on to some other stuff. All right, we're going to go and have a I missed a good tag. We're going to have a bad mark mixed with a good. So let's go and bring a little bit more positivity into this review because it's bringing me down. Fear and stress. The system they put in here for fear, in my opinion, is really, really lazy. It's just different ways to impose the frightened condition. I'm sorry, that's boring, that's lazy. Stress, on the other hand, it's done fantastically and actually models something how stress would feel. Whenever you're doing these dramatic moments, and whenever something would be really super scary or difficult for somebody, they take a level of stress. You subtract your stress level from all your rolls, and you only recover it by fully resting and taking time off from scary situations. The only thing I wish that they would add in here is the idea of having permanent mental scars added to your character. Because people who experience this stuff, that naturally happens to them. Horror heroes, they get messed up after time. All the best horror franchises, if they are any sort of realistic, they play on the fact that these characters are very different scarred people in the future installments. Go ahead and bring that in here. You can do it. It's not difficult. Pretty much every other game does it. Haunted traps. So my big problem with the haunted traps is the fact that they feel the need to have this big mechanical, even a little bit of a mechanical structure around what is basically a simple atmospheric effect. You don't need mechanics for this. You don't even need to call it a haunted trap. Just call it a manifestation. Do say it's something creepy. That's all you need. Some of the stuff, some of the haunted traps are pretty cool. But for the most part, it's just you don't need to have that structure. So we'll get to the adventure at the end. We're going to go and wrap up the main of the book with the ugly. This is just stuff that's neutral that I feel are either missed opportunities or just I think they kind of like might have missed the mark. Not necessarily bad, just not as useful. Um, so the first one's cosmic horror. Um, so cosmic horror, it's a really, really difficult target to hit. I'm not going to go into it very much in this video. If you want examples of what cosmic horror are, type cosmic horror into YouTube. You're going to get hours and hours and hours of information on what cosmic horror is, as well as explanations of why it's so hard to pull it off. Even the guy who invented it rarely pulled it off perfectly. It is basically horror without hope that's still scary. When it's done well, I absolutely adore it. And this might be my favorite genre of horror, but my god, is it hard to pull off. And I understand that. Even Call of Cthulhu, a game designed around cosmic horror, has difficulty hitting that target. Dark fantasy. Considering the rest of the content in this book, I'm not opposed to having dark fantasy in here because most of this book is dark fantasy. When they remove the horror bite like they have, what you're left with is dark fantasy. But I don't think dark fantasy is horror. It's fantasy that's dark. It's not there to scare, it's just there to be fantasy that's dark. So moving on to more neutral. We got a couple domains in here. Borka, I mean, it just didn't really jive for me. I mean, it's kind of interesting. There's a lot of political intrigue. They put more pages on Borka than I think any other domain, just because they got so much political intrigue on it. They keep talking about the manipulations of one of the two, because there's two Dark Lords. One of the they keep talking about the manipulations of Ivan, but they never actually talk about how he manipulates people, and it just seemed a little bit weird to me. It just didn't really jive for me. I didn't really get particularly inspired one way or the other about it. Falkovnia. I think Falkovnia this is more of a personal taste thing when I'm putting it as neutral. I think Falkovnia works as a zombie survival horror. I don't know why they keep calling it disaster horror and they don't call it survival horror, because survival horror can cover a lot more. But if you like zombies, you'll like Falkovnia. It's basically a D&D Dawn of the Dead. It's another one where they went ahead and changed Vlad Drakov to Vladeska Drakov, which, by the way, I do actually really like the increased representation that is in this book. I do think that's a note and it's positive. There's more women, there's more non-white people, there's more LGBT stuff thrown in, a little bit more representation both ends, and I think it's good. I appreciate that. But zombie horror isn't my thing. I don't find it particularly scary. I find it to be more action based. It's just not my thing. Harakir is kind of the same deal. Harakir feels very much just like a dark fantasy setting. There's a little bit of gothic horror in there, but it's mostly dark fantasy. Which, if you're looking for horror, which is kind of what I'm looking for, it's just not my thing. Mordant. So Mordant, I think, is why it's kind of being put in neutral for me, is it's focused on ghost stories. And I have such a high standard when it comes to ghost stories that it just didn't quite hit like I wanted it to. It's basically got like this ghostly tyrant who's kind of like enslaving everybody who dies as spirits. And it's just the thing where I just overall think it just didn't quite hit for me. Valachan. I think Valachan's concept is really good. I think just like so many of the other things, they just forgot to actually make it scary. Valachan is supposed to be a battle royale / slasher horror type deal, where the Dark Lord is this basically were-jaguar who's stalking you with the Splacer Beast through this whole thing. I don't tend to care for slasher movies, and I think that's probably why, but if you like them, you'd probably like this. It just didn't really hit for me. I can't really be super, super critical of it, and that's really mostly what this is, the stuff that didn't hit. There wasn't so much of it. The organizations I thought were, they're okay, they're useful, they're functional. None of them are particularly inspiring to me. Same thing with the Vistani. It's, they're a mechanic. They're integral to it, but they don't really jump out at me. Mist Wanderers, same way. There's a lot of emphasis on the existing major characters of Ravenloft. So I tend to not feature major setting characters in my games. I don't have a problem doing it with the Dark Lords, because quite frankly, if you're in Barovia, Barovia is all about Strahd. If Strahd's not featuring in a Barovia game, I kind of feel like you're doing it wrong. Obviously, your mileage may vary, and do at your table what you think is right. But it's just a thing. I don't really use it. I know a lot of people do, so I can't really get too big of an opinion or get riled up on it one way or the other. Um, Other little bit of neutral thing is when they did laying curses. I like the idea that they had curses in. I don't care as much for the codified way they did it, but I suppose you could do it that way. That's more of a taste difference. So I can't really fault them for it. And then they have survivors, which they're supposed to be more like sidekicks, simpler, lower level D&D characters. I kind of see it as a bit superfluous because why wouldn't you just have a low level character? Because these guys all have stats roughly equivalent to that, just have lower ability scores. So just make a basic D&D character with lower ability scores. No, that's my personal opinion. So let's go ahead and talk about the adventure. The House of Lament. This one I tagged as good, bad, and ugly because it's got all three of them in it. And I think in a lot of ways, this adventure really sums up the main issues I have with the book while still providing content I can use. House of Lament is supposed to be a haunted house story. And like I said, I am an absolute sucker for a good haunted house story. Um, it's got an okay story overview. It's not great. It's not terrible. It kind of puts the idea of the house as its own domain. Just who the Dark Lord is gets kind of a little bit weird. I did go and put as negative, and this is kind of where I start hitting my idea of where I'm seeing the biggest issue I have with this book. Spectral activity. They show you a whole lot of ghosts, and once again, when you show the monster, it stops being scary. The idea of nightmare awakening, where if you have a nightmare, you wake up somewhere else. Some of these are great. Some of these are really, really on the nose, and they're just going to be overdone. The seances. This adventure is basically focused around having 3 seances to contact the spirits of the house, which in and of itself is a really, really cool idea and a great thing that I wish more horror adventures would do. It is to the point where it is begging you. They've got a print up of the spirit board in the back as kind of like a Ravenloft specific. Honestly, if you really wanted to use it, I would even print that up. I would just go get a cheap Ouija board or something like that and use that. It's going to be more durable. It's going to be able to actually, hold it up. And quite frankly, if you're the GM and you got your hands on the planchette, you can move that thing all around as much as you want, or not, and just see where people instinctively move it. It's great. Where I start getting irritated on it is that each one of these has 3 different spirits that you can be speaking with, and how the adventure will play out will vary depending on which spirit. All of them effectively send you to do things, but one of them, and this is the one that I really don't like, just sends you out to fight monsters, which really winds up bringing to the issue that I have with this. Now, first off, guests of the house, they're some of the major players in Ravenloft. It's even Rudolph Van Richten can be one of them. I just don't like this. I feel like it's just pandering and trying to get people to interact with the setting. The basic adventure flowchart, the structure of the adventure, I think is very good. It is linear, but not very. Really, it is arrive, explore, seance, go deeper into the house and explore the things that change, seance, find the mysteries and find things that have changed, final seance, and the really creepy, horrifying stuff at the end. That's a good basic structure. So now we're going to get to the point where I think that with a very simple omission, you could turn this from being what I think is a pretty crappy adventure into a pretty darn good one. The House of Lament has you in various places. It's got the basic setup of a big haunted house, but the problem is it treats it like a dungeon crawl. As in, here's a room where you fight monsters. Here's a room where you fight monsters. Here's a room where you fight monsters. Here's a room with an awakened haunt that summons monsters for you to fight. When you wind up getting that action of I'm just constantly fighting monsters, you just stop being scary and it just starts feeling like work. So I would go ahead and say if you are going to run this and you want to really play up the creep factor, just remove all those random monsters. In fact, don't have a single monster in here. Have it just be the ghosts. Have it just be at the end. Have a single combat encounter, and that's with all the creepy crap at the end. Then you're fine. And then you'll wind up having some really, really cool stuff, especially when your players get into the nursery and whatnot. There's some really good creepy imagery in here, and this at that point I would like it. And that's the main thing I have to say about that. So there are a couple things in here that are notably absent. Um, there's not a single NPC or Dark Lord stat block in here. The only stat blocks are for these monsters at the back. Um, I know enough about D&D to know that D&D loves stat blocks. They will put stat blocks for everything. They'll put stat blocks for gods that you should never actually be fighting, that you'll never need. There are no cursed items. There are no creepy magic items. Um, there's no extended examples of what the Taroka deck is. There's a lot of those domains that feel like they should have been full write-ups but aren't because they're classic Ravenloft things. They don't have the Necropolis. They don't have Forlorn. They don't have a whole bunch of things that are like really standard Ravenloft. Um, so that's basically telling me something. The book clocks in at 256 pages, so it's already long for a D&D supplement, and it's missing all this stuff. That tells me that this book they had to pare down and cut to the bone to fit inside their publishing requirement, which tells me it should have been a 2-book set. Maybe that's where all the horror advice was. Maybe there's where all that was. Maybe all that missing stuff that I think really needed to be in here. Maybe they had to cut it just to get the basic content in it. I would say, as an overall setting, I mean, as critical as I was and as worked up as I got reading this, I've got a lot more purple than I got red in my tags. Most of the red was in one specific area when it comes to their attitude towards scaring your players. The actual domains, for the most part, were all pretty good, including a couple that were excellent, and one that was, in my opinion, pure brilliance. I do think it does a good job of taking Ravenloft and bringing it into the modern era and kind of getting rid of a lot of the outdated elements that just didn't age well in the original Ravenloft. Quite frankly, we have a different view now on marginalized people and LGBT representation and all that kind of. So we just have a different view on that now, and I think this does a pretty okay job at pulling that into the 21st century. It's just that one chapter where they kind of try to remove all the bite, and that's the big issue that I have with it, and that's just what I couldn't stand. Initially, it really got me riled up. I think now I'm not quite as riled up. That chapter certainly does, mostly because of what should have been in it and what, at least what my opinion should have been in it. It kind of makes me want to do more YouTube videos and more like Twitch streams talking about how to make an RPG scary and how to do it in an actual like healthy way. And I might do that because I always need another project to work on. But if you're taking a look at this purely as a setting project and purely as a product where you're going to find these Ravenloft domains, I think that's really good. And I think it really succeeds in that regard. Initially, I kind of thought that this was going to be a 50-50 mix of horror game mastering 101 and shoehorning shoehorning D&D into the horror show. I was wrong. It's a setting book with, as far as I'm concerned, no real applicable horror advice. And that is disappointing. But at the same time, if people who are new want to get the information on how to do good horror, there's lots of resources out on the internet for it. I do think anybody who's interested in doing horror games should absolutely pick up Call of Cthulhu. That game does a fantastic job of teaching you how to run horror games. So that's kind of my opinions. That's my hot take. I don't want to make it sound like too overwhelmingly negative because it's really not. I'm not comfortable giving this product a rating just because I kind of feel like they made a design decision that I highly disagree with. And that's where a lot of my negativity comes from. And I understand why they're doing it. D&D is becoming more mainstream. You have big celebrities openly admitting to playing it now. D&D 5th edition is trying to appeal to the widest audience they possibly can, so they have been sanitizing it and removing a lot of the bite and edge from it. And from a bottom line perspective, I can't really blame them. But at the same time, it does feel like we're kind of missing something. And I would say overall, my opinions are good, but not good enough. I'm not mad, I'm disappointed, which may be worse. But that's really going to be my final opinion. I do want to run a Ravenloft game, and I would like to run a Ravenloft campaign. Let's get that away from the ring light so you can actually see the spooky cover. I don't think I'd run it in D&D, just because I don't think D&D really works that well for horror. I think it lacks some stuff with the system. I'd probably run Ravenloft and Savage Worlds, and I might go ahead and do that. But that's my opinion. Take it or leave it. Your mileage may vary. I mean, obviously, what flies at your table is what flies at your table, and how you want to run things is how you want to run things. And I will not tell you you're wrong. But I have been running horror a long time, and I'm pretty experienced when it comes to it. So that's what I think. All right, guys. Well, let me know if you want to see more of this type of content. I have no problem reading books cover to cover and then telling you what I think and picking them apart. I can get a little bit riled up. I generally don't. I'm normally pretty easygoing, just some things do. But yeah, let me know if you want to see more of this content. We'll be back to painting more miniatures next week. Maybe I'll go ahead and try painting some spooky stuff. Till then, be good to each other. Enjoy your tables. Peace out.